Give us a little background on what you're doing now. Like besides running for Congress and writing a blog, what do you do for a living these days? And give us a little background about Jonathan Pelto.
Okay, even take one step back. So I ran for the legislature when I was just finishing up my senior year at UConn. Had just finished up my senior year and served in the legislature from '84 to '93. My first daughter was born in 1993. She just graduated from college last year, and I brought her onto the floor of the House, as is the tradition, to introduce her to my colleagues. And one of the long-term state rep sitting next to me leaned over and said, I just missed my daughter's 8th dance recital, because dance recitals are the first week of June, and that's when the legislature is trying to get through its deadline. And I realized that while I enjoyed being a legislator and had gotten up to the number 3 spot in the House and had sort of seen myself as a classic politician, full-time politician. I had started with Chris Dodd. In fact, first time I was here was when Chris Dodd was a congressman, and I was an errand boy in 1976 and 1978. And so I had learned a lot about politics and enjoyed it, but realized that it just wasn't conducive to family life. So I actually resigned midterm, resigned a month later, and spent the last 20 years being a hands-on parent. I had a successful public relations company that was issue advocacy, worked for a number of different unions, advocacy groups, the nonprofit providers of community services, the Connecticut Realtors, the Mohegan Tribal Council, not the casino, but the Tribal Council was a client for all of those years. And after about 17 years, decided that the challenges of the economy and the overhead, something you all are very well aware of just trying to make ends meet in order to get close enough to paying payroll. And as I say, for me, it wasn't the rate of taxation, it was the bureaucratic way in which the taxation was just one more factor that had to be dealt with. So I closed my business in 2000. And for the last 6 years, I've been splitting my time between my blog, Wait What, which I believe is the most read commentary site in Connecticut, and also working on public education advocacy and against the privatization of public education. And I do that around the country, working with parents groups and teachers groups and building support for public education and in opposition to the charter schools and the testing frenzy and the Common Core and the Every Student Succeeds Act and things like that. I was a Democrat, registered as a Democrat on my 18th birthday, and have been ever since up until this year. I sought to collect signatures to challenge Malloy 2 years ago and found out the hard way just how quote-unquote rigged the system is to make it virtually impossible for challenge candidates outside of the two-party system. At the time, the Green Party had been very helpful in, particularly the New London Greens, had been very helpful in collecting petitions. And earlier this year, they asked whether I would run and try to hold the line so that getting the 1% so that they would automatically have the position next time. And it sort of brought together a number of different factors in my mind about the need for third parties to really begin to challenge both the Democrats and the Republicans, or more likely, the way as I would describe it, the incumbency party. And although in Washington that's a polarized two-party system or one-party system that has two halves, here in Connecticut it's the Democratic Party, and have come to realize that without any kind of challenge you have the kind of situations that we have both in Washington and much more apparent immediately here in Connecticut, where the process has changed to the point where rank-and-file legislators are told how to vote, and for the most part they do that. It's such a different environment than I had worked with when I was a legislator. And so the Greens had asked me to consider taking this spot, and both out of appreciation for what they had done and also the growing realization that it doesn't have to be the Greens, but there has to be the development of some third-party apparatus in the country, that it would give me a chance to explore that and to work on that and to keep my finger in the electoral side of the puzzle. And so I've been doing that for the last couple of months. I was driven in part. I have always been a Joe Courtney supporter. I served with Joe in the legislature. We were good colleagues when he ran for office, both the time he lost and the time he won. He used my office as his call center for fundraising, so I've been close to him. There are two votes in particular that sort of are examples of where we split, and it wasn't so much to run against Joe as it was the recognition of, as I said, the development of a third party and trying to infuse some greater discussion with 95% of incumbents winning re-election. And little to no opposition for many of them. The thought was that while as a candidate I had always enjoyed not having opposition, in retrospect it was really not healthy for the democracy or even potentially for the incumbent, because you don't have to campaign, you don't have to be challenged in any way. And so there were two issues that I wanted to challenge Joe on, and we've had some pretty good discussions about them since then. One was his vote to ban Syrians, which I thought was just was a significant symbolic vote that came down on the wrong side, that there are some fundamental votes that we take, that being one of them, that really tells you where you stand on issues that are sort of most fundamental to American system of life and democracy. And I think well, I won't speak for him, but I'll guess at recognizing that the 2nd Congressional District voted big on Perot and likes, doesn't necessarily follow the mainstream. I think he felt that growing frustration about immigration, and that was sort of a symbolic gesture on his part to say, I hear you, when I felt it should have been a symbolic gesture to say, you're actually wrong, there are things that we can do, but this isn't the way to go about it. And then the other is his support for the Every Student Succeeds Act, and that really fits into the whole education privatization issue and the testing frenzy and the way in which the federal government has really contaminated education policy at the state level. And I suppose his argument would be, well, it was better than the No Child Left Behind under Bush, and then Race to the Top, which was an expansion of all of those privatization issues and government interference and local control and the development of the Common Core. And then Every Student Succeeds Act arguably was a little bit better than those, but it still maintained all of the very negative aspects of education policy. And I felt that he was in a unique position, having served on the committee, to have voted against it and made a statement that really wasn't the way that Congress should be going. But the Obama administration has been big supporters of this. It leads to massive campaign contributions. I'm just working on a book now about the role of big money in privatization of education, and so I understand why incumbents in particular would gravitate towards voting with the privatization interests, but I thought that was a mistake. So those were two examples where I said, that clearly could challenge Joe on that, as well as sort of a series of broader issues where I don't think Joe necessarily has fallen down on the job, but might not have gone as far as he could have, or even gone down the path. As I was coming down, I was remembering Chris Dodd used to always talk about, and certainly he was no pacifist, talk about the importance of submarine contracts and defense contracts, but he also talked significantly about defense conversion. And here we are 40 years later, having made no progress other than, that two-sub Joe is a sign of success, as opposed to saying, what have we done under the Gadenson years or the Courtney years in really having some kind of defense conversion towards production and products that would be less dependent on military spending and more useful to long-term health. And we just, state of Connecticut the other day, bought some more train cars for Metro North, and those train cars are built outside of the United States, and they can't even be renovated in this state because we don't have the mechanism to do that. So on issues that range from taxation to defense conversion, I've sort of looked at this opportunity as a way to try to influence the discussion and the debate. And one of the healthy signs, I thought, was that both with the Day and the Bulletin, both including me in the upcoming debates was a recognition that people are looking for alternative voices, and that it's time that we not limit it just to the two-party system. I'm realistic. 2%, 3%, 4% would be incredible if I could get that in this kind of political environment. I run into people every day who say, well, I'd explore the third party, particularly talking about the top of the ticket, but it comes down as well. They say virtually to a person, we need a third party, but I need to use my vote to stop Donald Trump or stop Hillary Clinton. And I think that sort of contaminates the debate. This cycle, not that third parties were about to burst onto the scene, but in a very big way. But nonetheless, with Gary Johnson getting more sizable number than traditionally third party would get, and Jill Stein picking up another 2, 3, 4%, you clearly have now easily a quarter of the people, 20% of the voters who really want to move to a third party. I don't think in the end they will. I think they'll gravitate towards using their vote as a mechanism to stop the other bad candidate. But on the horizon, there's an opportunity to really capitalize on the desire to find some alternative parties or alternative candidates.
So I'm interested. I understand now why you are running, but what you said seems to discount the impact that Bernie Sanders had on the Democratic primary, and the changes and the debates, the discussions that happened between Sanders and Clinton in that primary.
Yeah, and I don't mean to discount that. I think that it was an example of this underpinning desire to see the Democratic Party either return to its roots or recognize that the corporatization of the party and the status quo is not serving it well, that people want to see some change. But I felt like Bernie Sanders never did have a chance, that the way that the superdelegates are chosen, the way that the party structure works, that he certainly did better than anybody could possibly imagine, and was able to raise significant amounts of money, which really helped a lot. But that and that knocking on the door was much more than I would have thought possible, or the shaking of the gate of the establishment approach. And I'm glad he did it, but I don't think it provides necessarily the pathway towards change in the longer term. It hints at the possibility that with the right kind of challenge candidate, the Democrats can make it their way back, but it also says that despite this extraordinary moment in time where you had a well-funded juggernaut, it still came up short, and that it doesn't dismiss the need for there to be more efforts to sort of say the status quo is not sufficient.
But don't you think his efforts actually moved the party on trade issues, on minimum wage, on paying for college?
Yes, I do. Yeah. And that's exactly, in the sense of his challenge, or arguably the role of third parties, would be to do exactly that. So on the tax issue, I thought he was successful in some, not as successful in others. Hillary Clinton is now talking about the wealthy paying their fair share and and reforming Wall Street, but those are sort of hollow arguments from her based on her background. But she clearly had to pivot in order to bring the party together, and that happened more than I would have thought 2 years ago looking at this. I think that was an eye-opener to me of how far Bernie Sanders could get.
Mm-hmm.
Quick housekeeping question. How did the gubernatorial effort turn out? What was remind me?
You needed 7,500 signatures. We're never sure how much we ended up with, but a good example, I think we were somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 of the 7,500 we needed. But we went through certain towns. Clinton was an example. West Haven was another example, where they rejected 50% of the names we had seen. And so we went back and we checked them all. And I remember looking in Clinton, the first 3 names that they had rejected were clearly voters. It was maybe the birth date was wrong, or it was the name was, the voter was Susan Smith Jones, and she had on the voter list had it as Susan Jones, but when she wrote it, it was Susan Smith Jones, because the rejection occurs at the local level. So we collect all the petitions then get sent to the 169 towns. The local registrars then review them, and you could almost see where there was a Democratic registrar, a Republican registrar said voter, 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 voter. Democratic registrars were looking at, whether it said junior or senior or the
okay.
and
I don't want to spend too much time. I remember there was controversy
there was a lot
associated.
of controversy with that.
So, by the measures we've seen, American students compared to their international counterparts in the Western world and even Asian world underperform. They don't do well in the testing comparison, and we know we particularly have a problem in our inner cities and our poorer communities. So it does not, in large ways, our education system does not seem to be working as well as it should. So do you reject the federal model? Do you think it should not be coming at all down from the federal government? Are you more in the camp that let the states and local communities solve the problem? I'm just trying to understand what your end game would be for fixing education, since you've made it like kind of a core issue for even running for Congress.
I think that the barriers to educational success are poverty, language barriers, unmet special education needs, and the bureaucratic control of what goes on in the classroom. I think those four factors, and we hold up Finland as an example of the sort of the best. And once again, they were selected as the best education system in the country. My father's family is Finnish, and I was there for 2 weeks this summer, including meeting with education people. And so those four factors. Well, poverty, they're a welfare socialist, Western socialist state. They have no fundamental poverty. So rather than 1 in 3 kids living below the poverty line, or one in every 2 or more in urban areas, they have poverty rates of less than 5% at that kind of poverty, because they have free health care and free a variety of different services that reduce that kind of poverty. On English language learners, they, of course, don't have nearly the problem. It's a very homogeneous country, so it's easy to say, look at that, but they have very little immigration. But what immigration does occur, both the parents and the students are learning Finnish at the same time, because you actually can't really function in the country without learning the language. And so there's very heavy-duty programs to support families as a family to learn the language when they brought in as immigration. Very different than here, where we now have second and third generation non-English speaking people, because you can get by without speaking the language. So if we were really concerned about educational achievement, we would recognize that while schools can't solve everything, that as long as you have the kind of poverty that you have, and you don't have the support services in schools to make up for that, then you've got a problem. If you have English language learning issues, you now have 60% of the students in Hartford go home to households who don't speak English. You've got significant problems, and the way the federal government has handled it is it's really reduced the amount of bilingual education, let alone something like dual language, where you're teaching content in both Spanish and English, and what they find is that kids are learning much better. Here, you're allowed, under federal law, you're allowed 2 years of English language services, and then there's no federal funds available to pay for those services afterwards. So if you have second and third generation non-English speaking families, kindergarten, first grade, they've already used up all their ESL money. So now they're in second grade, they don't speak English, and there's no federal funding for that, as opposed to, again, the Finnish model, which is everybody is going to learn Finnish and we're going to do it as a family. In the U.S., Connecticut, we have about 15% of the kids who receive some kind of special ed services. In Finland, it's just over 30%. their definition of anybody who falls behind is in need of special education services. So when you have children that are falling 1 or 2 grade levels behind, they're not automatically saying that that's a special ed problem. It's a problem of not sufficient support, regardless of what that's for. And then finally, they have one standardized test. It's at the end of high school, and it's not used to judge the students per se going backwards, or the teachers. It's used to judge which college they can get into. And so rather than doing the teaching to the test and the development of the rigid standards, the latest standards, for example, for high school, the Common Core standards are that only 30% of the reading can be in fiction, 70% has to be in nonfiction. And it strikes me that when you get to that level, and I say this as a liberal Democrat who believes that government has an important role to play, but when the Common Core mandates that only 30% of your high school curriculum can be in fiction, in ELA, in English Language Arts, you've got a level of control that has gone off the deep end. And that, in fact, in Finland and in countries where they do well, they're dealing with poverty, language barriers, special ed, and they're giving teachers the ability to teach and requiring teachers. I mean, they're well paid, they're well regarded. It's not an easy process to become a teacher, but there's a recognition that somehow the teaching profession is more important than it is here. At least the message is that we're getting here from the federal government and the state governments as well.
Without testing, though, I guess we would depend on the grades, and the evidence is you can get grade inflation, where a teacher says, everybody in my class get an A and B. That makes me look like a pretty good teacher, so I'll figure out a way to make sure everyone get A's and B's so all the schools can go along happily saying, our kids are doing great. They're all getting A's and B's. Everyone's graduating high school, and then they go to college and they can't do they have to have a remedial English, remedial math class too. So without some testing that's objective and sort of equal, how do we know really if our kids are doing well?
Right. I mean, there's no silver bullet here. There's no simple answer, and I think it would be absurd to say there shouldn't be any testing. The evidence is that grade point average is a better indicator of college success than standardized tests. But you still have that problem, and you have that problem of gaming the system. So in Mansfield, Connecticut, at E.O. Smith High School, they're working with the teachers to ensure that the students have the kind of grade point averages that are going to allow them to get into the good schools. And you don't necessarily have that in New London or Norwich or other places. So just grade point average alone. So you've got to have testing. The question is it testing that's developed off the curriculum, state specific or town-specific off of the curriculum. We don't have a national curriculum. We have a set of national standards, sort of, with the Common Core. We don't have a national curriculum. All of that's developed at the local level, state and primarily local level. And yet the testing is based on the Common Core standards, which are running 1 or 2 years ahead of where students are presently at. So if you're testing them on Common Core standards, that there has not been a long-term development of a curriculum that's bringing those kids up. The perfect example is in order to pass the SBAC, you need geometry at the 11th grade level, and almost half the kids are just beginning geometry when in fact the test is based on the assumption that they have already completed geometry and are into calculus. There's about 20-25% of the test that's calculus, and almost the rest of it is geometry. You're going to get the kinds of failure rates because the 11th graders, particularly in places like New London, haven't had the background work to even begin geometry by their 11th year. So theoretically, the Connecticut Mastery Test was based on the Connecticut standards and curriculum, as much as there was sort of a centralized curriculum. And the reason you saw it drop from about 70-80% of kids at grade level down to about 35-40% is we went from a test that was theoretically based on curriculum to a test that was theoretically based on standards that we admit are not associated with the curriculum, or at least not yet. So the problem is the simplistic, and it's across all kinds of government areas, that we need simplistic answers and we need quick answers, and also that we're not sort of grappling with, as President Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex in his final speech before he handed the Oval Office over to President Kennedy, and here we are, and for all intents and purposes, we have the development of an education industrial complex, the testing, the software, the professional development, the all-new textbooks, the all-new software that goes with that. And those are tremendous pressures to change the system. And within that, we then have this desire for very simplistic answers. And it's just not going to happen, particularly when the barriers to academic success are these really difficult things like children coming to school unprepared, going home to households that don't have a long-term recognition of the importance of education or the mechanism to support homework. And so now you start getting some sort of absurd proposals like, let's do away with homework as a way to equalize opportunity. And you say, well, why is that? Well, because in urban areas, they're not getting the kind of support they need at home. So if we get rid of homework, we'll sort of even out the wealthy areas and the poor areas. And I mean, it's a very serious proposal that's going around now of saying, homework should only be done in school so that then every child has the opportunity to do that. So again, sort of these simplistic answers.
It's interesting to hear you and Chris Powell couldn't be any more far apart on the political spectrum, yet in some ways you seem on this issue to come to some common ground in that some of the fundamental root causes of our education problems are social and economic, and that if you don't turn attention to those, you may have only limited success educationally, and now I think you would have different approaches to how you get to that, to those improving the economy, improving culture. So I mean, is that part of? Yeah.
I remember back to that political science 101 where we would debate, is political philosophy on a spectrum or is it a circle? And there's a little bit of thinking here. I mean, the other place that he and I agree but disagree on how you get there is the seriousness of the debt. I mean, at the federal level, it is arguably the debt is so significant, but as long as you can keep printing money, it's an impact on the economy versus Connecticut that really is much more closer to the edge than, I mean, we're more like Puerto Rico or Greece than I think people would even remotely admit. So as a liberal Democrat, my feeling is, where are you going to come up with the revenue in order to pay down the debt? And we still have to maintain some vital services, and we still have to do these important things. And so you have to go from a regressive tax system to a progressive tax system. I think conservatives like Powell would say, well, the debt is so serious that you have to move your resources over and knock down the debt and stop using the credit card as a mechanism to maintain current services. And deficit spending is never appropriate. And so we could argue about, relatively limited ways of dealing with it, but Bernie Sanders put forward a very aggressive tax package that went after the rich and large corporations, and he wanted to use that money primarily to maintain current services. My argument would be you shift the taxes over, and in order to build support for that, you use that money primarily to pay down the debt. That's what really has to happen if you're going to have a long-range solution to how to maintain services, is that you can't have 15, 20, 25% of your annual budget going to pay for debt over the course of the next 40 years. So you better knock that debt down aggressively. And so if you're going to raise taxes significantly, then you better use that money for something other than maintaining current services. And the only time I've talked to Powell about it is he says, well, begrudgingly, I'd go for taxes but they'll never do it. And that may be true.
You talk about converting defense jobs to some other manufacturing. What would that be, and why do that now when defense is so busy down here.
Right, and that's part of the problem. I mean, you know, the Green Party's proposal is to cut the defense budget by 50%. We'd still spend more than any other country, and their argument is that as long as you have the kind of waste that you have with the new aircraft carrier, the USS Ford, that $13 billion started out at $8 billion, now $13 billion can't be used because they haven't figured out how to load the planes, how the planes can take off, or how it can defend itself. Or you have the F-15s, that you could cut the defense budget. Sooner or later, the fiscal reality is that we're not going to be able to maintain this kind of defense spending. So now is the time to, I mean, we should have done it back in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, but now is the time. And you do it in a combination of ways. First off, you do a set aside, so you say every defense budget, every defense contract has to have 15% or 20% towards the development of conversion or convertible technologies. And then at the same time, you shift down, and so instead of closing 2 of the community technical, the VOTEC high schools, you actually recognize that sort of this elitist attitude about, well, the VOTEC high schools are for those kids, and I think that's really been changing dramatically. Most of the kids who went to the VOTEC high schools out of my class are now doing just fine, with some of us who claim to be in the middle class just trying to make ends meet. And so I think there's now a growing recognition that the vocational technical high schools are providing skill sets that, particularly where they're developing programs like here at Grasso and elsewhere that are in direct connection with major manufacturing industries like Electric Boat. So, you know, the problem is you got to start, and if you don't start now, then when the budget is cut, or when it should be cut, then it's too late to do that kind of stuff. And at the same time, this growing, and it's sort of related, sort of not, of the growing indebtedness. So my first daughter just graduated from college. My other child is going to college next year, and I put the loans in my name, hoping that they'd be able to buy a car and buy a home. And I don't think I'm unusual of somebody now who's looking at the very real likelihood that my goal in life is to pay off my home mortgages, but I'm going to take my kids' student debt with me, because there's literally no way in the course of 20 years at the kind of money that I'm making that I'll be able to do both. And so I'll pay off my home mortgage, and hopefully that will be part of my estate, but that the student loans now is something that, as a middle-class family, we will have forever, or virtually forever. I mean, whatever that means. And I think that that's becoming very commonplace. And so Joe has actually done some work on this, but there's two different pieces to solving it. The first is allowing for restructuring those loans. Virtually every loan in the world is restructurable. Either we bail them out completely like we did with the banks, or at least we allow it to be renegotiated. Most of the loans that I have are at 7.9%. So the banks are getting their money at 1% at most, or 1.5% or 0.5%, and I'm paying 7.5%. And under federal law, I can't restructure those. The only way I could restructure them would be to actually tie them back to my assets, in which case then I run the risk of losing my assets. So we need to be the federal law needs to be changed to allow people to renegotiate those loans down to a reasonable rate. And then the second is we have to look at expanding. Right now, if you teach in an urban school system, you get loan forgiveness. We need to expand that to any variety of. I mean, it's a tax expenditure just like other kinds of tax expenditures. We give all kinds of business tax loopholes, many of which should be closed, but nonetheless, as a matter of tax policy, we say, as a society, we think that that's good, so we're going to give tax breaks to the movie industry for making movies. Well, we need to use a tax expenditure to say, if you're engaged, if your job is helping society, either in medicine or in nonprofit, then you get some forgiveness on your student loans. And so that kids are then said, here's the reality of the situation. You're carrying hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of loans, but if you spend 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years really rolling up your sleeves and helping society, then society will in return give you some forgiveness on those loans. And so I've laid out a couple of ways to go about doing that. And so different than defense conversion, but it's sort of the same kind of thing of how do you create an economy that has any chance at all for maintaining sort of basic middle class structure.
Kind of following up on Ann's question on defense spending, another big, in addition to being 2 subs Joe and pushing for expedited construction of attack submarines, the other big issue in that area for Representative Courtney is advocating to build the successor to the Ohio-class Trident submarines, which is a Cold War era submarine originally, basically floating missile launcher. And he recognizes that it's so immensely expensive that there's no way you can do it under the defense budget because it would just crowd out other defense spending. So he wants to go off budget, sort of with a special, submarine fund for the Ohio class. I was wondering what your position was on building a successor to the Trident.
It's such a slippery slope. I mean, I don't have a particular position on that piece of it, but as an example of how I would approach it, I strongly, although only a few people voted in what I thought was the appropriate way, I would strongly oppose the $220 million tax package to Sikorsky for building the helicopters that were already being built. The cost was covered, the profit was being covered, and Sikorsky was basically saying, if you give us $220 million, we'll build it here, and if you don't, we'll potentially move it someplace else. They then laid off 150 people. They then got a contract to hire up to 550 people over the course of the next 14 years, and we gave them $220 million all on our credit card, which is already maxed out. And so sort of this notion that we're in a constant battle in order to save reducing numbers of jobs or create very small numbers of jobs is just a very dangerous, slippery slope. I wouldn't say there's no scenario where it's useful, but there should be few and far between. And so directly to the question about the next generation Trident, I just feel like my gut instinct would be investing in other technologies and building alternative manufacturing opportunities would just be a better investment if we're going to do something off budget than it would be to go ahead and do yet another weapon system that is of little use.
Are you like fundraising, or do you recognize this? I think you've already acknowledged you have a realistic chance to win. So is it? Do you actually go through that process of trying to get your message out in that manner? Are you depending on the media, and what do you?
Yeah.
After Election Day, what would you see as a success?
Technically the success comes at 1%, so then the Greens have the seat 2 years from now, and that was the ask. They were under the impression that my name recognition might be higher and that therefore I would have an easier time getting 1%. I'm not sure that that's the case. I've been out of politics so long, I don't know that I have particularly good name recognition at the voting level. But I'd love to get 2 or 3%, and that would be ego gratification and some kind of indication that these issues matter to some subset of people. Realistically, I'll raise between $5,000 and $10,000. Joe is going to push $1.5 million. I don't know what Daria is going to do, but I assume it's going to be pretty low. And Dan, I think, said he isn't spending anything. The problem, and it's the Citizens United problem, and it's the power of incumbency, and it's the system that we've got, and it's the very issue of you look at at Joe's contributor list, and it's exactly who you'd think it would be. There's the Pfizers of the world and the defense contractors of the world, and these people have to work, but they have to work in order the difference between raising $1 million and $2 million, or $1 million and $3 million. My money is coming in from family and friends and people who are particularly concerned about some issue or another that I'm articulating, but it's really just to pay for a couple of mailings. I mean, having been all those years as a campaign manager, I know, how do you get 1%? You get 1% by targeting 3 or 4% of the people and really going at those people to make sure that they know that you're on the ballot and why you're on the ballot. And so I'm doing a series of small mailings that are not very costly and I hope very effective in getting the job done, which is to get the 1 or 2%.
You know, what's your kind of closing argument to us and to voters as to why in an election like this, where you have a very heavy favorite, they might consider casting a vote for Pelto on the Green Party line?
I think it's part of the changing. It's a process to change the political landscape and how politics is run, and that the presidential race is probably the most extreme example in our lifetimes of how not to do it. So then people say, well, what should we be doing? Well, we should be having discussions about these kinds of issues, and incumbents should be held accountable, and that I understand why Joe would be supporting those things, and the unions are very important, and these jobs are very important, and I'm not even suggesting that it's necessarily bad that Joe does that, but when he is unchallenged, when there's no accountability for that, when nobody raises the point of, well, why would we be spending this kind of money on the defense budget, and the entrapment of, if he's going to get money for these 2 subs, let alone fast tracking, let alone the next generation, that means he has to vote for the defense budget. And as bloated and as bad as it is, you're not going to be able, and I remember it wasn't, Sam Gadenson voted against it once and took so much flack that then he started voting for the defense budget after that, I'm pretty sure, that there's never any discussion about these things. And so the reason that you need third parties and you need candidates willing to go out there is yes, it attracts the gadflies and the people that go to the town meetings and complain, but it also provides a mechanism for people to have reasonable, thoughtful discussion, something that doesn't occur very often in politics.